We'll be looking mainly at Psalm 46, or actually exclusively at Psalm 46. And before we do, let's have a word of prayer. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I have this one. It's called alumophobia. It's the fear of garlic. I also suffer from apeirophobia, which is the fear of infinity. Other people have nightmares about monsters chasing them or bad guys being after them. I have nightmares about infinity. There is also something called arachibutyrophobia, which is the fear of getting peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth. There is barophobia, the fear of gravity, blenophobia, the fear of slime. Most men have this one. It's cholangynophobia. It's the fear of beautiful women. There is also consecutaliophobia, and that's the fear of chopsticks. I don't know what an Asian does with that sort of fear. There is something that preachers all have. It's called homilophobia, and that's the fear of sermons, or at least the fear of preaching sermons. You may not have that. You're here today and not trembling. But you probably do have, as most people I know have, katsiradophobia, and that's the fear of cockroaches. We call them palmetto bugs around here. We don't have cockroaches. There is also something that obviously either you don't have or you're managing well today. It's palatophobia, and that's the fear of bald people. Although it may be that some of you have this one. It's a phalacrophobia, and that's the fear of becoming bald. I've completely gotten over that one. I don't know what a hipster or anybody associated with a theological seminary would do with this one. Paganophobia, that's the fear of beards. A couple more. One is, another one that I like is hexacosioi, hexaconta, hexaphobia, and that's the fear of the number 666. But my favorite of all times is hippopotamonstrosesquipedaliophobia, and that's the fear of long words. Now, we may struggle with some of these, perhaps not these, but other phobias, but these may be humorous, some of them imaginary, none of them life-threatening, but there are things that are fearful in life that are life-threatening. And we've been through a time in our world of life-threatening things. We brushed with one here. Some of our near neighbors were not spared even as we were, and they just seem to be going on and on. These so-called acts of God, as the insurance companies call them, and also acts of men and women that are fearful things. Now, fear is a gift. We couldn't live without fear, but sometimes fear takes possession of our lives and will not allow us to trust and to have peace. And so we look at this psalm briefly today because it pushes us to consider some worst-case scenarios, and then it says, even in the midst of those worst-case scenarios, we will not fear. The first verses 1 to 3, paint a scenario that is something that we understand, and that's a scenario of natural disasters. But the psalmist ups the ante here. He imagined not only a local natural disaster, but the uncreation of all things. It says in verse 2, therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. And the image here is from the creation. And it's the uncreation, because what's happening here in the creation, you'll recall that what God did was He separated the dry land from the waters. He made the mountains and separated them out of the waters. And the psalmist is contemplating the possibility of the creation being uncreated, of the mountains once again slipping into the heart of the sea, and there being no distinction between sea and dry land again. In other words, he's painting a picture where there would be no place to go, no place to hide, and no possibility of finding a place to go or to hide. In a very localized way, that's what happened in some of the islands in the Caribbean. An island that has been inhabited for hundreds of years, Antigua, and now it's uninhabited because there was no longer any place to go. But he's contemplating this on a worldwide scale. But he says, even in the midst of this, Even when there's nowhere to go, no place to hide. In fact, there is a place to go and a place to hide. He says that in verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. So he's saying when all your options are gone, when there is nowhere else to go, no place where you can seek refuge, there is, in fact, and you're pushed to see this fact, that there is one and only one safe place for you in this dangerous world. God, our refuge and strength, very present help in times of trouble. Now, that is an argument from greater to lesser. It's the argument from worst case scenario to our lives, because none of us have ever faced this kind of devastation. And he's saying, if God is our refuge and strength, even in the uncreation of all things, then God is our refuge and strength in our lesser trials and our lesser fears. That's the first scenario. The second scenario he paints is local assault in verses 4 to 7. And here he transforms the water imagery. The water imagery in the first 3 verses is a threatening image of everything sinking back into the primordial chaotic waters. But here he uses the same image of water, but he transforms it. And the water, instead of being threatening, the water becomes life-giving. Verse 4, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. And he seems to be contemplating here, contemplating Zion, contemplating Jerusalem, contemplating the holy city, but he's contemplating this city as under assault. Verse 6, the nations rage, the kingdoms totter. It looks like the city is being surrounded here. In verse 5, it talks about when the morning breaks, the dawn breaks, and it looks like it's painting a scenario when the besieging armies are around Jerusalem. And of course, we know that happened more than once in Old Testament times. And by the way, if you're in a besieged city in ancient times, what is one element that you absolutely need in order to hold out? Water. You can hold out for a long time without food. You can hold out with weeks without food. You can even hold out without armaments or armies, but one thing you can't hold out with for more than just a few days is water. And that's the image here, and it's saying that in the midst of a besieged city, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. But it's not only this water, but even better than water, verse 5, God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. And then we have this refrain, and it's repeated twice in verse 7 and verse 11. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. And it's interesting, the combination here, the Lord of hosts using his covenant name, Yahweh, but he calls him the Yahweh of armies, speaking of his might, but then he calls him the God of Jacob, recalling the God who keeps his promises, the God who is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that God who is the Lord of armies, that God who keeps his promises, that's the God who's with us, even if we are besieged from all sides. And so he reminds us to remember this God who is with us, who's in our midst. This is the psalm that Luther reflected upon. We don't know exactly. There's several different ideas about when he wrote this song, the most famous of his songs, A Mighty Fortress. But this was the psalm that inspired him to write that song. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. He amidst the mortal ills, he amidst the floods of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. We're not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. Dost ask who that may be? Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabaoth, Lord of hosts, his name, from age to age the same, and he must win the battle. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. the prince of darkness grim. We tremble not at him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word will fell him. That word above all earthly powers, no thanks to them abideth. The Spirit and the gifts are ours through him who with us sideth. Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. The body they may kill, God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever. Natural disaster, local siege, and the last situation is worldwide chaos. Verses 8 to 11. And here he escalates. We have been considering the possibility of worldwide chaos, haven't we? North Korea threatening with nukes, our president responding with tweets, and people fearful that one of these could do something foolish. And then, of course, China would be involved, and then Taiwan would be involved, and Japan would be involved, and NATO would be involved, and Germany would be Germany and part of NATO would be involved, and then there would be others involved. Russia would certainly be involved, and we can imagine, can't we? Although we haven't lived through that, those of my age, we haven't lived through that sort of worldwide chaos, but we're looking at a possible scenario like that. But in the midst of this, it says that even so, God will break the war machines. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. How many of you lie awake worrying about a Mongol invasion? Anybody concerned about the Huns showing up? No? What about the Aztecs or the Incas? Or the Babylonians, or maybe the Greeks or the Romans, or more recently, what about the Spaniards or the British or the Soviets or the Germans or the Japanese? Anybody worried about them? What happened to their war machines? God crushed them all. And someday historians will look back and say, oh, there once was a mighty nation. It was a superpower in its day, but its war machines were crushed as well. You see, that's what God has always done. That's what he will do, even in the midst of worldwide warfare and chaos. And then he says in verse 10, be still and know that I am God. Even if this breaks out, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. And I have never been able to decide. And actually, I go back and forth, and now I don't know which to choose. I'd love to take both, but you'll have to ask your professors which is right of these interpretations. I'm not sure to whom he's speaking in verse 10. I don't know if he's speaking to the nations and saying, nations, raging nations, warring nations, shut up and sit down because I am God. Or if he's saying to us, God's people, in the midst of those warring nations, my people, sit down, be still, and know that I am God. And then the refrain once again, the Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. And this is the message of this psalm. In verse 1, it talks about God's presence. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. In verse 5, he says, God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. Verse 7, the first time the refrain, the Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. Verse 11, once again, the Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. What's the message? The message is God is with us, therefore we will not fear. But that's a good message, summary message of the Bible, isn't it? In the beginning, God walked with his people in the garden. And then throughout their trials, he marched with them in the desert. And in fact, Moses said, Lord, if you don't go with us, we're not going. There's no point in going. We'll just be like all the other nations if you don't go with us. And God said, my presence will go with you. And we see that he established his presence in different ways throughout the years, but then he finally established his presence in the most definitive and amazing and surprising way. You will give birth to a son, and you will call his name Jesus. But he also will have another name in that same first chapter of Matthew. And what is it? Emmanuel, God with us. And so Psalm 46 becomes flesh. The Lord of hosts is with us, and his name is Jesus. The God of Jacob is with us, and his name is Jesus. And what did that Jesus do in addition to becoming one of us? He was overcome by the disaster and the destruction and the conspiracies of this world. He succumbed to it in our place, and then he conquered over it on the third day when he rose again from the dead. What is it that causes you stomach aches, sleepless nights, anxious days? It may be something that you can work on and avoid and improve. Or it may be imaginary, but most likely it's real. Most likely it's a real threat to your well-being. Well, what do you do in that case? John Wesley, reputedly, on his deathbed, when he was having trouble breathing, he gathered up some breath, and his family around him knew that he wanted to say something, and so they listened to him attentively, and he said, "The best of all is God is with us." And then he gathered up his strength once more, and even more forcefully said, "The best of all is God is with us." And he was right. But not only for our dying moments, but for every moment of our lives in this dangerous world. And so we say with Luther, but even more importantly, we say with the psalmist, therefore, we will not fear.